The Biblioteca de Catalunya in Barcelona preserves an extraordinary collection of manuscripts of polyphonic music from the late 14th century. I have long been fascinated by the mystery surrounding these manuscripts, namely because most of them have survived as fragmentary vestiges of lost books, and their provenance remained obscure in modern scholarship. Although some scholars had suggested possible connections between some of these fragments and the royal house of Aragon, the evidence was so vague that it was hard to take these assumptions for granted. So I have taken a further step in investigating the provenance of these fragments within the framework of the project MALMECC, Music and Late Medieval European Court Cultures. This is a multidisciplinary research project based at the University of Oxford and funded by the European Research Council. Given the potential connection of some of the Barcelona fragments with the Royal Court of Aragon, my investigation began by identifying the provenance of the fragments, and not only those of Barcelona, but also those preserved in other Catalan archives. And the problem was that, well, the original manuscripts were destroyed in the 16th century, when the music they contained became obsolete. It was a common practice to recycle the parchment of obsolete books, and just by chance, a few leaves were reused to cover notarial documents from the 16th century, which happened to survive in ecclesiastical archives. Most of these fragments were discovered in the early 20th century by a musicologist called Giovanni, who also happened to be the director of the music section of the library in Barcelona. So he took most of the fragments he discovered and brought them to Barcelona. The problem is that Anglès was not always very accurate in reporting the provenance of his acquisitions. So I began my research by taking a closer look at the marginal annotations in the fragments, which sometimes provide important information about the archives where the fragments were reused. The idea is that the identification of patterns of provenance can tell us something about the possible origins of the lost books. That is, the context in which the original manuscripts were used as practical sources for music performance in the 14th century. And indeed, I found that most of the fragments come from cities and institutions in which the royal court had a particularly strong influence. I have recently published my research in a volume edited by Giovanni Varelli, Disjecta Membra Musicae. This is a volume which collects new studies on musical fragments from the Middle Ages, and which is available in open access at the Gruyter's website. I will put the link in the video description below. So at the end of this article, I provide a map showing the provenances I have identified. And since I suppose that most readers will be unfamiliar with some of these places, I decided to make a video in order to give a taste of the historical sites and buildings that are mentioned in the article. I have been performing research in Catalan archives for many years, and I always enjoyed and had fun traveling through Catalonia and visiting those amazing places. So, as I thought it would be nice to share this experience, in my last research trip, I took some filming equipment with me, and I had extra fun in capturing footage of some of my favorite places. In this video, I will be commenting and showing images from Barcelona, the Royal Monastery of Poblet, the town of Verdú, the city of Cervera, and the ecclesiastical archives of Tarragona and Vic. Our trip begins in Barcelona, at the Royal Palace, right next to the cathedral. King John I of Aragon was an enthusiastic lover of music. He literally emptied the royal coffers towards the creation and maintenance of a flamboyant court. Over 460 documents and letters preserved in the royal archives in Barcelona attest to John's compulsive, really obsessive attitude towards bringing the best and most demanded singers and instrumentalists to his service. One of the most notorious examples of musical exchange between the royal court and an ecclesiastical institution involves the Cistercian monastery of Poblet. Located in the countryside at some 10 kilometers from the royal city of Montblanc, Poblet was one of the largest and most important monasteries in the Principality of Catalonia. In 1340, King Peter the Ceremonious founded a dynastic mausoleum in the Abbey Church of Poblet and promoted important construction work at the monastery. From then onwards, the Abbot of Poblet held the office of Royal Almoner and joined the itinerant court, officiating the divine offices together with the clerics of the royal chapel. Monastic records bear witness that a singer of the royal chapel, the French cleric Colline Le Forestier, lent the Abbot of Poblet a book of motets. And at least 3 dismembered manuscripts of polyphonic music, now preserved in Barcelona and Tarragona, were used to cover notarial documents in villages that were under the jurisdiction of the Monastery of Poblet. The new identification of Verdú and Fulleda as the provenance of these fragments reveals a pattern of dispersion of obsolete manuscripts originating in Poblet. Verdú is a rural town that belonged to the royal monastery. The abbot was the town's lord and had a castle there where he used to spend relatively long periods of time. The Church of St. Mary dates from the 13th century. The community of priests obviously had close ties to the monastery, although it reported directly to the Bishop of Vic. New evidence confirms that it was precisely in the parish archives of Verdú where Angles found the fragments of 2 substantial manuscripts of polyphonic music from the 14th century, now kept at the Biblioteca de Catalunya in Barcelona. The Archdiocesan Archives of Tarragona preserved the fragments of yet another polyphonic manuscript that could have originated at the Royal Monastery of Poblet. The fragments Tarragona II and III come from the parish archives of Passanant and Fulleda, respectively. Passanant is a very small rural village in the area of Poblet's fief, while Fulleda directly belonged to the Royal Monastery. Although Tarragona II and III have always been treated as 2 different fragments, I show that they actually belonged to the same manuscript. The original codex was most likely kept in the library of Poblet until it was dismembered in the 16th century and its parchment was sold as recycling material to parish churches within the monastic fief and neighboring villages. The fact that the parish archives of Passanant made use of parchment from other medieval manuscripts showing clear Cistercian features reinforces the Poblet hypothesis. In the article I discuss many other manuscripts and places, but I would now like to jump to my final case study, which involves the small village of Granyena and its neighbor royal city, Cervera. The 16th century notaries of Granyena made use of a large number of medieval fragments to bind their notarial manuals. These include a bifolio removed from a book of polyphony, which I argue originated in the Church of St. Mary in Cervera. Cervera had enjoyed the status of royal town since 1275. Its strong industrial and commercial activity gave rise to an incipient bourgeois class, and by the 14th century it was considered the 8th most important city in the Principality of Catalonia. The Church of St. Mary in Cervera constitutes a remarkable example of Catalan Gothic architecture. Its cathedral-like structure comprises 3 wide naves with lateral chapels and a polygonal apse with an ambulatory and 8 radial chapels. Merchants and citizens assumed the costs of the radial and lateral chapels and turned them into family mausoleums. An inventory of books drafted on the occasion of a pastoral visitation by the Bishop of Vic in 1425 attests to the fact that the choir of the church in Cervera was provided with not just 1 but 3 books of polyphony. The episcopal notary reported that the bishop was content with what he saw and ordered that the books be attached with chains to the lecterns. Indeed, this seems to suggest that the cultivation of polyphonic music at Cervera was modeled after the practice in Vic Cathedral, which also tied to the royal court. The Episcopal Library of Vic hosts one of the most impressive ecclesiastical archives in Europe, and again, among the medieval fragments of parchment that were reused in later periods to protect notarial documents, there is a fragment of 14th century polyphony that may attest to the musical practice at the cathedral. In contrast with other regions of modern-day Spain, Catalonia presents an extraordinary panorama of sources of late medieval polyphony. Not fewer than a dozen of manuscripts, datable roughly between the late 1370s and the 1420s, come from historical archives within this relatively small area. Although the vast majority of these manuscripts survive only in a fragmentary form, they offer us a fascinating glimpse not only into the topography, but also the sociology of this musical style in Catalonia. Probably because it was intensively cultivated at the royal court, this musical practice became fashionable also among cathedral clerics, church priests, and even Cistercian monks, and was increasingly appreciated by citizens. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you feel curious about the activities of our research group, please visit the MALMECC website. Thanks for watching.